Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to the third section in Sacred Contracts written by Carolyn Myss. Now, we're going to read for sure section 3, and then it's actually pretty short. So we're going to read section 3 and section 4 definitely in this video. So we left off talking about contracts of the myths. So talking about myths and legends from Greek mythology and even older than that, and to more recent, and when I say recent, I mean still pretty ancient, but how contracts were made back then, even from a biblical standpoint. And now we're going to be talking about the ascended masters, or the masters. Okay, so contracts of the masters. The Hebrew Bible, known to Christians as the Old Testament, together with the Christian New Testament, amount to an extensive documentation of God's contracted agreements with the people of Israel and later with the followers of Jesus. Indeed, the English word testament itself refers to a legally binding agreement, as in last will and testament. In the opening chapters of Genesis, Yahweh makes an agreement with Adam that he may eat freely of every tree of the garden, except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For in the day that you eat of it, Yahweh says, you shall die. Adam and Eve fail to keep their agreement, and they suffer the consequences, death and foreknowledge of death. According to Rabbi Harold Kushner's intriguing theory, Adam and Eve were not actually punished for eating from the tree of knowledge, but simply entered the world of human consciousness that separates us from the animals, who don't have to make the kinds of moral and ethical decisions that are integral to thinking people's lives, or to a sacred contract. But the fact that Adam and Eve's troubles began when they did not uphold their end of the agreement with the divine shows the importance with which our Western spiritual ancestors endowed contracts. And God's contract with Noah, as we have seen, provided for nothing less than the survival and flourishing of the entire human race. Now, I personally have a different understanding. I used to believe the actual story of Adam and Eve, but I personally think it is more of a metaphor for Atom, A-T-O-M, and Eve. There's a whole other explanation for it, because we've been taught to take the Bible quite literally when much of the Bible is metaphorical, especially in the stories that today we would find quite unbelievable, like the boy who wasn't eaten by the lion and the one that was in the belly of the whale. I think it was Jonah. So some of these are metaphors, but it doesn't, at least in my opinion, but it doesn't mean, even though I view it like that, that it isn't the same idea behind it, talking about the contracts and agreements. Here we go. Adam, Eve, and Noah are clearly metaphorical figures who represent reinterpretations of the creation and flood myths of ancient Mesopotamia, which the ancient Hebrews would have assimilated into their culture, along with a respect for law and order. But Abram, later called Abraham, must to some extent have been based on a flesh and blood character, the founder of the Hebrew race and religion. His detailed, personalized story, and those of other spiritual leaders who founded many of the world's great traditions, represent compelling manifestations of a sacred contract in action. The wisdom of men such as Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, and the Buddha shines through all mythic overlays and religious dogmas. The truths that they embodied in their lives transcend cultures and personal beliefs. You needn't be an Orthodox Christian to believe that you should love your neighbor as yourself, for instance. Nor do you have to be a Buddhist to acknowledge that the craving, hatred, and ignorance that derive from seeing ourselves as essentially separate from all other beings are the major source of suffering in our lives. Regardless of the master's traditions, their teachings speak to us because they lived actual physical lives. They also confronted universal challenges on their paths to self-awareness and to comprehension of the power they carried inside them. Sorry, the book is a little bit top light and bottom heavy now, so it's a little harder to navigate here. Each of them had to awaken to the full measure of his contract. They were not born enlightened. That is also another huge misconception of Jesus, that he was born enlightened. He had to go and learn all of the things that he learned. He traveled. He was taught by the Essenes and other ancient teachers that helped him to learn all the things that he learned along with his time in the desert when he officially sort of came out of those 40 days as Jesus the Christ. All right. Each of them had to awaken to the full measure of his contract. They were not, I already read that, sorry. Their teachings are blueprints for what our spirits need to do to make the transition from seeing life in physical terms to understanding the purpose and meaning of life on a symbolic level. Many of us believe that if only we were smarter, more dedicated, or holier, we would know what we were supposed to be doing on earth, because then God or the universe would enlighten us about our real mission. We mistakenly believe that the great spiritual leaders such as Abraham, Moses, the Buddha, Jesus, and Muhammad had their contracts spelled out for them. Yet none of these figures truly saw his contract early on. Their life paths were not obvious, but required that they develop the trust and stamina to surrender unconditionally to the will of heaven. As a rule, that doesn't happen to a child or an adolescent or even a young adult, nor does it happen all at once. We develop faith and other abilities in stages. And our progress becomes most obvious in midlife. Oh, isn't that the truth? Still, some people do acquire insight in a single rush, an epiphany. For instance, otherwise ordinary people who have had near-death experiences report a sudden awakening, after which they become conscious of their life as part of a larger plan, and they live it differently from that point forward. In the Hindu tradition, spiritual and non-spiritual people alike have reported an extraordinary surge of energy, known as a Kundalini awakening, that shoots up the spine to the crown of the head and often transforms the focus of their lives to spiritual service. These ancient spiritual leaders, a man, came face to face with God and truth. In their humanness, these prophets, as well numerous other saintly men and women, felt confusion and fear as they learned the meaning of their tasks. Guidance was often given to them when they needed it, but they still often doubted themselves and felt abandoned, even despairing as they sought to fulfill their mission, which some of them learned quite late in life. Each struggled with his ego, and each was tested, some several times, to determine whether he could finally connect with the divinity within him. Collectively, their lives form the archetypal prototype for the process of how a sacred contract is revealed. We'll go through the 5 stages of a sacred contract in the next chapter. But first, let's examine some of the themes or soul tasks that appear in these stages. Need to make a little more room here, sorry. 4 of the prophets went through a renunciation of their previous life and identity and were reborn with a new identity. Each also was renamed to recognize this spiritual attainment. A ritual soul naming occurs when an individual can no longer be recognized as his normal self by the society he serves, when he is evolved beyond his human function into eternal self, a universal leader or embodiment of a greater truth. Abram became Abraham when the Lord sealed their covenant. Jesus became known as the Messiah, and after his death as the Christ, or the Anointed One. Following his spiritual transformation, Siddhartha Gautama became the Buddha, the Enlightened One, and Muhammad, son of Abdallah, came to be known as the Prophet. A soul naming also represents a conscious fulfillment of the necessary tasks of service, the sacred contract. The individual has come fully into his power, even though he has not yet completed his contract or life. From that point on, he or she operates only from the power of the soul and speaks only with the voice of the soul. So the soul is given its own name. The ego or former self is no longer dominant, but becomes a servant companion, a vehicle through which the soul communicates messages from the divine. And our next category or section, orphans and expatriate heroes. As Joseph Campbell writes in The Hero with 1,000 Faces, the really creative acts are represented as those deriving from some sort of dying to the world. The archetypal hero's journey described by Campbell, Sir James G. Fraser's The Golden Bough, and others always begins with a process of separation or alienation from the tribe, followed by a series of difficult challenges that the hero must meet alone. The journey culminates in a descent into the abyss of self-doubt and a loss of faith in the divine, but then results in a vital transformation and a renewal of trust, which in turn leads to a revelation of some new knowledge, insight, or wisdom. The hero then returns to the tribe and imparts this insight, or tries to, since heroes, like prophets, are not always welcome in their hometown. Their presence unsettles us and makes us aware that other truths and lives exist beyond our physical routines. Yet we fear the disruption that pursuing our divine potential would create, even though our everyday comfort will be disrupted if it is standing in the way of our contract. We are our biggest obstacle, are we not? Optical. I've been at work too long today talking about eye doctor's appointments. When you become conscious of your contract, as opposed to living in an unconscious way, you go through a painful process of severance, similar to the hero's journey, because you are no longer part of the tribal mind. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, Jesus said. You have broken away from the general mindset, and the group is likely to perceive your individuation, like anything new or different from the status quo, as a fundamental threat to its own unity. Ironically, as in the case of these great teachers, severance from one's personal tribe can lead to something beneficial to the survival of the universal human tribe. The great mystics, Abraham, Moses, the Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, all shared a common fate of abandonment and separation from their tribe early in their mission, and this alienation or exclusion was essential to the completion of their contract. Abram left the ancient Sumerian city of Ur and set out for Canaan, then later was compelled by famine to make a sojourn in Egypt. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, the Lord told him. Another key figure in the Hebrew Bible, Moses, was an orphan who was forced to flee Egypt after killing an Egyptian in an act of rage. After God appeared to him in the burning bush, Moses begged not to be made the leader of his people, insisting that he had none of the requisite qualities. Jesus' own parentage was questioned by his neighbors, since Mary was pregnant when Joseph married her. As a perceived bastard or mamzer, the child of a woman, which is the child of a woman impregnated by someone outside of the community, Jesus would have been without a voice in his local congregation. No bastard shall enter the assembly of the Lord, the Torah commands, and this is from Deuteronomy 23:2. When he returned to his hometown of Nazareth after his enlightenment to teach, Jesus was met with a cold reception by the contemptuous locals, who said, "Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us?" But later, when Jesus was preaching and was informed that his blood family was listening outside, his response was, "Who are my mother and my brothers and my sisters?" Looking around at those sitting near him, he indicated that they were his family. Although many of the people of Israel followed Jesus and his teachings, the leaders of his own religious tradition, for the most part, rejected him and his message. His outsider status would mark Jesus throughout his public ministry. In marked contrast to the humble, shadowy origins of Jesus, the Buddha was born into a wealthy and powerful family in the foothills of the Himalayas. Had he remained at home, he probably would have become a tribal leader and a great warrior. Legend holds that on the birth of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha-to-be, an astrologer told his father, Suddhodana, that the boy would become either a universal monarch whose chariot wheels would roll across the land, or an enlightened one who would set in motion the wheel of the Dharma, the great truth that would alleviate humanity's suffering. Wow. Suddhodana, I think that's how you say it, Suddhodana, that's Gautama or Buddha's dad. I'm not sure how to say that, so I'm sorry if I'm butchering that. Suddhodana preferred the first possibility, but despite his best efforts, he could not keep his son from discovering the world of suffering and death outside of his opulent palace. What I have read about Jesus is that his mother thought when she was giving birth to the Messiah that she was giving birth to the Jewish Messiah, to the Messiah of Judaism, and was sadly disappointed and a bit surprised that that was not his message at all. Judaism wasn't his message at all. I think a lot of us forget that he actually didn't belong to a religion, and he wasn't of Judaism. He wasn't Jewish in the teachings. He did not agree that God hated or punished or even felt any kind of pain or sadness. He had a different message that she did not that she basically was not prepared for and had a totally different idea of. Although married with an infant son, Siddhartha determined to leave behind home, family, inheritance, and tribe, and embark on a hero's journey in behalf of humanity. He became a voluntary orphan to search for truth and explore his inner self. Drawn to the saffron-robed figure of a wandering monk who appeared serene amid the suffering of the world, Siddhartha shaved his head and went looking for a spiritual teacher. According to tradition, he studied with two of the leading meditation teachers of his day and practiced extreme asceticism with a small group of like-minded seekers. Asceticism is an extremely disciplined religious person or spiritual person or group. I think that even back then they practiced whipping themselves. I don't know if you've ever seen that in any movies or shows, but they would whip their backs in showing their faith and their love for God or their religion or whatever it was. But asceticism is a very strict, rigorous way of living a spiritual or religious life. Okay. And now I lost my spot here because I went off script like I always do, but I can't help it. Let's see. Okay. Yet in time, Siddhartha rejected both the conventional meditation and the asceticism of forest monks, along with the established priestly religion of the Hindu Brahmins, once again orphaning himself in order to discover his own path. Like Jesus, he returned from his journey with something of great value to the tribe. I hear he did this for many, many years, and only once he stopped did he actually find his contract. Did he actually walk his true path? The Prophet Muhammad's father died before he was born, and his mother died when he was only 6, leaving Muhammad under the protection of his uncle, Abu Talib. Although he was cared for, to be without parents in the tribal society of 7th century Arabia left one vulnerable both financially and physically. Yet Muhammad drew on his reserves of inner strength and integrity to establish himself as a reliable caravan worker. He was entrusted with storing the possessions of other merchants and was given the nickname of Al-Amin, the trustworthy. At the age of 25, after successfully managing the caravans of a wealthy female merchant named Khadijah, he accepted her offer of marriage, even though she was 15 years his senior. When Muhammad was about 40 himself, he began to receive revelations from the angel Gabriel in a cave, where he went to meditate. These transmissions from Allah, which is Arabic for the God, eventually formed the Quran, Islam's sacred scripture. Yet as Muhammad relayed the revelations first to a close circle of family and friends, and then to others in the cities of Mecca and Medina, he began to draw fierce resistance from fellow Arabs. Many opposed these new teachings, which forbade the worship of idols and threatened the role of Kaaba, an ancient Meccan place of worship that was also a great source of commerce in that part of the Arabian Peninsula, or modern-day Saudi Arabia. The local clans also scorned the social reforms included in the Quran, which mandated caring for widows and orphans and greater rights for women, who at the time were treated largely as chattel. At one point, Muhammad was forced to seek refuge from threats against his life in the mountain forests of Abu Talib, where he became a virtual prisoner. A lengthy military campaign and pitched battles followed, but Muhammad prevailed, initiating a long era of spiritual and material growth for the very tribe that had so fiercely rejected him at first. His message has since spread to include about 1/6 of the universal tribe. Once each of the spiritual leaders become conscious of their purpose, it reshaped their life entirely. Abram, for instance, was a fairly prosperous herdsman in the nomadic tradition of the Semites before he was awakened by the voice of God. Moses, too, was apparently content tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro before the same voice woke him up. Jesus toiled as a carpenter until the heavens spoke to him at the age of 30. The Buddha was 29 and a child of privilege when the inner call sounded. Muhammad was prosperous and 40. These men did not grow up knowing that they had a divine destiny. They had to learn their contracts. All right, so we're going to stop right there, and we've got, in our last leg of this section of the book, we've got 3 relatively short sections. So happy to announce that I won't have to break this up into more than 3 videos for this chapter. So we're going to stop right there. In the next and last sections of this chapter, we're going to read the Great Missions, the first sacred contracts, and I think that might be it. Yeah, so 2 left, and in order to avoid making this into a 35 to 45 minute video, I'm going to be content with stopping right here, and I hope that you are too. So we'll put my bookmark in it. And yeah, thank you so much for joining me. I love you all very much. Please take care of you. Please take care of those around you. And I will see you all again soon for the last 3 sections of Chapter 2 in Sacred Contracts, written by Myss. Take care until next time. Bye-bye.